In Lesson 1-6, you will learn how to multiply and divide integers. Basically, you have two rules when multiplying and dividing. If the two numbers are the same signs, the answer is always positive. If you have two numbers that have different signs, the answer is always going to be negative. For example, -5 times -7, since they're both the same sign, the answer is going to be positive 35. In the problem -5 times 7, since you have one of each, it's going to be -35. I have a little saying that helps you remember this. And anytime you see a positive, you're either going to be saying good things or good people. And when you see a negative, it's going to be bad things or bad people. So, for example, good things happening to good people is good. Bad things happening to bad people is also good. Same thing applies for division. Or good things happening to bad people is bad. Bad things happening to good people is bad. It's just a little saying to help you remember. If you get stuck on a quiz or test, you could try to remember that saying to help you determine the answer. Another way I found to help remember whether the answer is going to be positive or negative when you multiply or divide integers is to use a little tic-tac-toe board where you fill in the diagonal from the upper corner to the bottom right corner with positives and everything else with negatives. And then what you would do for this example up here, -5 times -7, a negative times a negative, you look somewhere on your tic-tac-toe board where you have a negative times a negative. Negative times a negative is a positive. Or in this example, a negative times a positive. Negative times a positive is negative. You can also work your way up and down. A negative times a positive is negative. Or if we go back to this first one, a negative times a negative is positive. That could be another helpful hint. Say when you take your quiz on Friday or your test for this unit, you could draw this up in the corner of your test, and that can be something you refer to when you're working with multiplying or dividing negatives. First example, -6 times -8. Good things happening to bad people is good, or sorry, good things happening to bad people is bad, -48. Or if you have one of each, it's always negative. Using the tic-tac-toe board, you would go up here and say a positive times a negative is negative. Next example, -2 times 2. One of each is always negative, or bad things happening to good people is bad. 9 times 2 is 18, so -18. Or on your tic-tac-toe board, a negative times a positive is negative. In the third example, -4 times -3, they're both the same sign, so the answer is going to be positive. Or bad things happening to bad people is good. Or looking at the tic-tac-toe board, negative times a negative is positive. In this problem right here, when you have a whole string of numbers being multiplied together, every time you have two negatives, A negative times a negative is going to be a positive. Remember, you can switch the order around when you multiply and still get the same answer. So I could multiply these two together first because of the commutative property of multiplication. And a negative times a negative is going to be positive. And this negative times this negative is also going to be positive, which means this whole problem, once you multiply all those numbers together, each pair of negatives will cancel each other out. And since there aren't any extra negatives left over, it's going to end up positive. Basically, if you have an even number of negatives, your answer will always be positive. If you were to have an odd number of negatives, once you pair up your negatives, you'll always have one left over, and that extra one is going to make the whole problem, the whole product, negative. So an odd number is going to be negative. As I was just saying, when you have more than one integer, you can move them around because of the commutative property. So in example 4, negative 2 times 13 times negative 5. If I just worked from left to right, I would have 2 times 13 being 26, and then I'd have to do 26 times 5, which becomes a little more difficult to do without a calculator. But if I were to rearrange this and move the 5 over by the 2, negative 2 times negative 5 is going to be a positive 10. And then 10 times 13. Anytime you multiply a number by 10, you move the decimal over one place to the right. So in this case, when you move the decimal one place over to the right, you have to add a 0. You get 130. I also know the answer is going to be positive because I have an even number of negatives. Now let's move on to a couple division problems. The division problems are done with the same rules as the multiplication. If you have one of each, it's always going to be negative, or bad things happening to good people is bad. So negative 24 divided by 3 is going to be negative 8. And then negative 30 divided by negative 15. Since they're both the same, the answer is always going to be positive, or bad things happening to bad people is good. Example 7 has you plugging in the values for the variables before solving it. This also right here, negative 2a means negative 2 times a. So negative 2 times a, and a is negative 3. So I'm going to replace the a with negative 3. And then minus b. This could get a little bit tricky here if you're not careful. It's minus a negative 5. You have to remember it's minus a negative. Now, following order of operations, you would want to first multiply. Negative 2 times negative 3, they're both the same sign, so the answer is going to be positive. So now we have 6 minus a negative 5. When we're subtracting with negatives, remember from previous lessons, you change it to adding the opposite, or chop, chop. 6 plus a positive 5. Since they're both positive, you just add and keep the sign. So that answer is 11. Our last example says, for 6 consecutive days, the average temperature in Asheville was lower than normal. The number of degrees the average temperature differed from the normal temperature is shown. find the mean or average of those variations. To find the average, you add up all of your numbers and divide by the total number of numbers. So in this case, we're going to have -6 plus -1 plus -8 plus -7 plus -12 plus -8. And then you're going to, after you get the sum, you're going to divide it by 6 because there are 6 total numbers there. Addition, remember, is also commutative, so you can rearrange and add these numbers in any order you want, or you could just work from left to right. I'm going to go and put numbers together that are easy to add in my head. For example, 12 and 8 is 20, and 8 and 7 is 15. So 20 plus 15. And of course, these are going to be negative because these are all negative numbers. So you're going to add and keep the sign. So we have -20 plus a -15. That brings us to a total of -35 so far. -35 plus one more is -36, plus another 6 is going to bring me to -42. Divided by 6. Since you have one positive and one negative, the answer is going to be negative, or bad things happening to good people is bad. 42 divided by 6 is 7. So the average is 7, or 7 degrees Fahrenheit. -7 degrees Fahrenheit.